Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. As we record this episode of the podcast, a programme for government is being agreed by the parties and independent TDs who will form the next government. And as we look forward, we also wanted to take a look back at the general election campaign in November and to the policy work we carried out as part of that campaign, and outline some of the actions that we took as an organisation to introduce our manifesto and to encourage the various election candidates across all the parties, non-parties, independents and so on, to engage with it. So to do this kind of look back and look forward a little bit, I'm joined, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Frances and Emily. Frances Byrne probably needs no introduction. She's Director of Policy at Early Childhood Ireland and a frequent podcast guest. She's passionate about advocating for children in early years and school age care in our member settings in Ireland in relation to government policy. Emily Clarke is Press Officer on our policy team, and her role involves liaising and communicating with the public through various forms of media about the policy and advocacy work which Early Childhood Ireland is engaged in at any given time. So you're both really welcome, and I'm delighted to have you both on the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Maura.
Thanks, Maura.
So our manifesto was called First Things First, and in it we called on the government to set a date by which early years and school age care graduates would be brought within public sector pay and conditions in line with teachers. So Frances, I might start with you. How was the experience? And Emily, chime in with what you each did in relation to the election campaign. So maybe Frances, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. For Early Childhood Ireland, the campaign started not quite this time last year, but certainly before the summer. We had identified 4 asks for children, and we had identified them based on what we thought were some of the gaps that hadn't been addressed, like family leave and like capacity planning. And then 2 things that we felt were critical in order to build on the progress that the then government had made, and indeed the government before that. So we settled on making family leave better paid, so that every child in Ireland in their first year could be guaranteed a dedicated carer at home. In a 2-parent family, one of their parents, and obviously in a 1-parent family, their sole parent, and then of course there are children who grow up without parents, so that there would be a dedicated carer for every child. We know that really helps with brain development, with emotional development and so on. It's offered in other countries, it's taken for granted. Taxpayers and employers are more than happy. Well, maybe not always more than happy, but it's just taken for granted. So that was important to us. On capacity planning, while we acknowledged that the Department of Children had set up a unit, that was very good, but we were hearing stories. I mean, on a weekly basis, we would get contacted in Early Childhood Ireland by politicians or by journalists about planning issues, normally local planning. A builder is refusing to build a creche, or there's a creche in my area lying empty for months, or whatever it might be. But also we were very aware of the data, which is very welcome data from Pobl, showing the extent of waiting lists and the lack of places. And then there were the 2 things that we felt were very important to build on what had already been done. One was the last government reached an important funding milestone 5 years early in 2023, which was honouring a commitment they made in First 5 to double funding. which de facto brought us to €1 billion for the first time in early years and school age care. That was very welcome, but no new target was set and no plan to spend it. So what our members in every county in Ireland will tell us, among other things, is that it makes life very hard for them when they can't plan. They can't sit down and have conversations with parents, with staff, with their own families, with their own accountants and so on, with their own boards of management of their community about the medium to long-term future. And that obviously has a huge impact on children, on families as well. And last but not least, we really felt that it was very important that Ireland as a whole really started to recognise and value educators. And we decided to focus on educators who have equivalent qualifications to primary school teachers and to bring them into public pay. And that was our main ask then when the election was called. The 4 asks formed the basis of our budget campaign, but I think it's important to say we were having pre-election discussions with everybody in the Oireachtas who we could, but with particular politicians from the Oireachtas Committee on Children and others. As early as last April and May, we had an event in Buswell's Hotel with our CEO, Teresa Heaney, for particular members of policy teams in parties and indeed for spokespeople. And that continued all the way through the summer up until the surprise election was called, or the election was called, because there was that question, and we talked about this on the podcast before, Maura, about whether the government would go to full tilt. So then as things got closer to the budget, and then right after the budget, obviously our work became very intensive.
So Emily, I might bring you in there on kind of what your role was and how the experience of your first general election campaign as a press officer in Early Childhood Ireland was.
Yeah, so I found the first campaign I've done really interesting. There's a lot of learning experiences, but I really enjoyed it. It was really good to do. So as Frances mentioned, we did start this with our 4 Asks for Children. So from a media perspective, that was launched through our Budget 2025 media campaign. So throughout that campaign, we had a few different milestones where we focus on each of the asks. And one in particular performed really well, which was our capacity planning, our ask for capacity planning. So as settings reopened after the summer break, we issued a press release highlighting the waiting lists for early years services nationwide, putting the issue on the agenda. We were really pleased with the results, and we had coverage in nearly every county across the country, and with data of the capacity for children under the age of 3 on waiting lists for an early years place. So despite this widespread coverage though, and the political interest, the outcomes for Budget 2025 unfortunately didn't deliver for early years and school age care, as we know. So we went out to media to convey this disappointment in the outcomes and to ensure that early years and school age care remained on the media and political agenda. So we continued to advocate for that through the media, through interviews and press releases, and just background contact with journalists. And then, as Frances mentioned, we chose to focus on the first of our 4 asks for our media outreach during the general election campaign. So we went out to media calling for parity of pay for early years and school age care graduates and their colleagues in primary education. So throughout the general election campaign, along with our press release, we were monitoring media to see what politicians had in their manifestos, what the media were talking about, and see where we needed to react and where we needed to come in.
And I suppose moving on then from the 4 asks, and I think that background is really helpful on the way that an election campaign starts way before the starting gun is fired, so to speak. Why did we choose to focus on of the 4 asks? Why was the graduate pay issue the one that we chose to focus on for the manifesto? I'm not sure who's going to take that.
I'm very happy to take. Yeah, I'm very happy to take that. I suppose when we stood back and looked at the system, at the issues, at commitments that have been made, it has to be acknowledged that great progress has been made in relation to a number of areas. And I think that we decided, both from international evidence that we have, assuming that every political party who was running and most of the independents supported a public model. And we looked back in that context and said, okay, what is the missing link, if you like, that would really make a difference in a stride forward in terms of getting us to the public model? And if you look at public models that work for children, that work for families, that work for educators, for society at large, where those waiting lists that Emily was referring to don't exist. In fact, you make yourself very popular. When Emily and the colleagues on the media team get us great coverage, and I'm on interviews, myself or Teresa are on interviews, and we mentioned the fact that in Denmark, parents are contacted before their child turns 1 year old, and they're offered either a choice of a setting or a childminder. You get all kinds of text messages in going, oh my God, how is that possible? So when we looked at all of that and we made a judgment call, and I suppose, to be very frank, we have to make these calls all the time because we know the political system that we operate in. We've seen it, and not just in relation to early years and school age care, but look at our housing, look at health, look at anything. Governments are short term, they're 5 years. We felt that this was something that could definitely be achieved over 5 years. Our ask was very careful to say, name a date. We weren't saying that when the Dáil meets, or even in Budget 2020, when Budget 2026 is announced, that pay parity was to be announced. We said, name a date. We hoped that date would be in the lifetime of the government. We knew from members, we knew from educators, we knew from our own research and evidence that if that happened, even if the date was 2028, we knew it would give immediate succor to the students who are in colleges all over Ireland, who entered last September, who are coming out this June with degrees, and who are considering not coming into settings. We knew it would give them succor. We knew those in settings already would feel that immediately, even if it wasn't going to happen overnight. So it really was a question of what's the evidence telling us, and the Irish political context, and a bit of pragmatism. But we probably could have, if we were only pragmatic, we probably could have got other things. Really what swayed us was what's in the long-term best interests of children. It's heartbreaking for us to hear Teresa, our CEO, was asked to speak, to hear the stories about graduates. Teresa, our CEO, was asked to speak at the graduation of a college with a wonderful, wonderful early years program. Everybody had graduated in June. Teresa went along September or October to the graduation. 50 graduates, and only one was working in a setting. That's a very, very sobering thing to hear. When we say that to people involved in politics, their jaws kind of drop,
Yeah.
So that it was a combination of what's in the best interest of children and pragmatism, to be very, very frank with the listeners, Maura.
Yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking when you hear that, and I suppose we always know that there are a percentage of students who are using early years as a stepping stone to maybe primary education. That can't be the case for all of them. I mean, some of them, the vast majority probably choose that degree because they want to work with our very youngest children, and they can't because of the pay and conditions. And they see their school friends who are often going to the same college studying similar subjects, and their futures are going to be so different in terms
Exactly.
of pay and conditions. And our young children deserve that level of expertise, professionalism, and so on, along with the vast experience that the people in the sector already have built up. So I suppose going back to the campaign, Emily, I'll ask you what the challenges were within the campaign as it evolved. Certainly early years, from the early stages of the election, it was very much on the table. It was one of the priorities that came up very, very frequently, and lots of promises were made by lots of people in that regard. But can you take us through some of the, and we'll turn to the highlights in a second, but we'll maybe look at the challenges first.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there was a really big focus on early years throughout the campaign, but the focus mainly was on affordability for early years of school age care. So we were kind of fighting from a media perspective to have our issue with recruitment and retention heard. So we had to make sure that when we were going out with media releases, when Frances was doing interviews, that we were explaining how capacity planning and other issues that the system is facing cannot be achieved without starting with staff first. So we did welcome the focus on early years and affordability, but from our point of view, it just won't be feasible without a sustainable workforce. So yeah, we did have to, from public affairs and the media side, we did have to look at bringing home that message that the affordability for parents won't be feasible if we don't start with staff. I don't know if Frances wants to come in with some challenges from the public affairs side as well.
No, I'm only to add, yes. I mean, it is very challenging. You can't really go out in the airwaves and say affordability is a bad idea. Of course it isn't. And then it becomes quite nuanced because you're trying to explain the how of how if affordability is addressed in a particular way, then you might see all boats being lifted, but it's very difficult because, as the majority of listeners will know, our system is very complicated, the way funding is delivered. So I think for us, the big challenge was trying to be very clear in interviews that covering the salaries, bringing salaries into public pay would, of course, reduce fees. But of course, that would be over time. So you're not getting that instant, as some of the political parties had, that they would do it sort of first 100 days type thing, or certainly in the first budget. There was some differences between the parties. So that's very challenging. And it's very hard to sort of sway the conversation publicly. I don't mean in individual interviews. I suppose the thing that we did have going for us, if you like, in the public discourse and then in interviews and in various op-eds and pieces we wrote, is that actually it's the capacity side. So when you look at those stark figures about waiting lists and the number of places, putting measures in for affordability for very hard pressed parents for whom we have enormous empathy, obviously. But doing that and only that is not going to build extra places, and nor is it going to staff those places. So we did. I think we got that across. But it's tough. And look, the thing about it is, as everybody knows, everybody accepts, it isn't as though the early years and school age care system in Ireland needs one thing. If that was it, Early Childhood Ireland's job would be much easier on the advocacy front. The fact is, it's complex. It's coming from decades of underinvestment, multiple funding programs, regulations, all of the things we know about. And so it doesn't make life that easy for us, where you'd be going in and saying, as some organizations get to do, we need X euro to go up on child benefit or on social welfare payments, or we need taxation to be reduced in the following way, or whatever it might be. Be a brave person saying increased, but so that definitely complicates communicating about our cause, whether that's in the media or to decision makers, or indeed with colleagues and stakeholders were also working to change things in the system.
It's hugely important. It's so important that the quality aspect isn't lost in discussions about affordability. Like you say, we all accept that early years is expensive. It's expensive to provide, hugely expensive for parents, and we hear settings putting up fees and so on. But the quality, the consistency, the ongoing relationships, it's so important, so important.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why we chose staffing, because it's that relationship, it's that quality. It was at times, I won't say distressing, but frustrating that, I mean, I'm not accusing any politician of using the term cheap childcare, but that's almost what the discourse was about. That's not good. It is expensive to deliver. It ought to be. Other countries don't balk at the expense. Everybody participates. Everyone pays their taxes. Everyone has an expectation that it will be delivered, that it will be of high quality, that educators will have a career plan, that educators will be highly qualified professionals, all of that. And so that is tough. That is, it shouldn't be a tough sell, but it is, because we are decades behind other countries, notwithstanding all of the great progress that has been made, and all of the good things we can talk about that happen in settings every day, which is the other side of the media team's job and the policy team's job and Early Childhood Ireland's job, which is talking about that excellence in settings that is delivered despite the challenges and the pressures.
So moving on then, I said, we'd come back to the highlights, and we keep managing the challenges, and we will keep on managing the challenges. Emily, can you give us a particular highlight or two of the campaign?
Yeah, so from the media perspective, we were really happy how we were able to put capacity planning and some other issues on the national agenda. Frances here was invited for interview on RTE Radio 1 today with Clarke Byrne to discuss the general election manifesto. And later on then we facilitated an interview on Morning Ireland with our member Evelyn Riley from Kids at Play. And Evelyn discussed what providers want to see from the next government. So we thought that was really interesting. Those interviews were aired about a week apart. And it was really good for us to have both our perspective in the media, but also our members who do value their views and their opinions. And it was great to have their voices heard as well. On the week of the launch as well, Frances done an interview with News Talk, breakfast briefing. And later on that morning, Deputy Neil Richmond was on. He's talking about early years and school age care. And pay parity was posed to him as an interview question. So that was really positive to see that very soon after launching our press release and launching our manifesto, that it was starting to shape the media agenda and being put to politicians as a question, not just from us, but from other people too.
And Frances, have you highlights?
Yeah, and we also saw that unprompted during a political debate, the now outgoing Minister for Children, Deputy Roderick O'Gorman, and the Social Democrat spokesperson on children in the last Oireachtas, Jennifer Whitmore, both mention pay parity spontaneously. That was really good. And I suppose one of the things I'm always watching, consciously or otherwise, is, thanks to the hard work of our media team, Emily and the colleagues, we have great imprint on local and regional media, and local and regional media in Ireland is, long may it last, it is so important and so valuable and so valued by us, and I think valued in local communities. But it's just interesting if you're doing, series of interviews through the different milestones that Emily talked about and the kinds of questions you're being asked. So certainly I would say that April, May of last year, going into the, when we launched the budget, the four asks at that point, June, July, you were getting asked, well, how much will that cost? And, this kind of almost not horror, but my God, like, who's going to pay for that? And are you mad looking for that? I mean, I literally was asked one day, do you actually think you're going to get this? It's going to cost a fortune and it's going to be a commitment forever on an annual basis. But by the time the election came around, I wasn't getting asked that, and I haven't been asked it in any of the interviews that Emily has secured since Christmas. About talking about during the talks to form the government. So it's just interesting. Would it stand up in terms of evidence? But I would just, it's one of my reflections that we're getting asked different questions now, so in some way, the idea that this is possible has taken hold. The idea that pay parity is not a completely mad idea, that actually it's worth considering, that actually it's fair, and that actually it would be an important first step, and a very important signal. And it's interesting because in the last few days, had very engaged interviewers who have big listenerships. You get bombarded with text messages when you're on air. You can always tell. Actually saying those things, like saying, leaving aside money for a minute, isn't it so important that we value those? It's a signal of valuing and recognizing highly qualified professionals, and it's just great to hear that. Evidence, I don't know, but it's certainly a nice reflection for us of our work, the impact of our work.
And I mean, at a glance over the past couple of days of the draft program for government, and you've probably both of you had the opportunity to kind of study it in more depth than I have, but it seems very clear that there is a move towards a more publicly funded model, while acknowledging the role that private providers have to play. And for me, that would show that an acceptance of early years as a public good, um, and moving me hopefully towards a place where, nobody questions how much it costs to provide primary education in this country. Nobody questions how much it costs to provide secondary education in this country. So, isn't it lovely to hope that we're kind of moving towards a place where early years could be similar?
Yes, but unless when the incoming Taoiseach, who, as we're recording, we expect it to be Micheál Martin, unless the Taoiseach and or future Minister for Children, the next Minister for Children, we know one thing: it will not be Minister O'Gorman. Obviously, he kept his seat, but he's not part of the government formation. Unless that one or both of them is going to give the country and early childhood Ireland a lovely surprise, we are not seeing a vision or a plan for getting to the public model in the programme for government. Now, it's a draft programme. As we're recording, it has to go to parties, our Ardeshina processes and so on. And, we never give up hope. But to get to the public model, it's going to be incremental. It's going to be all of those things. Nobody expects it to happen overnight, but it's going to take a vision. And at least in the first look at the draft programme, not seeing a vision. The overall direction of travel, yes, but an apprenticeship and called earn and learn thing, not sure what that is yet, but we'll certainly be investigating that. And the employment regulation order are mentioned. And there is some mention of recognition and making career paths easier, but that's it. Now, there may be more detail behind that. We may yet get enormous leadership from the Taoiseach and or the Minister for Children. That will be so welcome. But in the absence of that, you'd be worried. So I think at this moment in time, we're going to have our work cut out for us. I think we need to hear exactly what's in mind. I think we need to see what the makeup of the next Oireachtas Committee on Children is. They had a brilliant report that they produced just over a year ago, or maybe it was this time last year when they actually produced it based on work they'd done in 23. I'm not seeing many of the recommendations of that Oireachtas Committee in the programme for government. That's a pity. That's an all-party and independent committee. So I suppose at this moment, Early Childhood Ireland's jury is out until we see more detail. We, absolutely would love to be wrong. Our next steps will be analysing it and then obviously contacting the leaders, contacting the next Minister for Children and all of that, and trying to get behind what we have seen in the draft programme. But just to agree with you, the overall direction of travel is absolutely towards a public model, and that is really important. It's the getting there that you'd be concerned about.
Absolutely, and the devil is always in the detail, as the cliche goes. So you alluded, Francis, to some of our our next steps, and there's an interesting, from the time of recording, there's an interesting week ahead. So can you take us through some of what our next steps are going to be, where our campaign will go next, as we, I suppose, start to think about the next budget, what we would like in the first government, the first budget of the incoming government.
Well, Emily and I and the other colleagues will sit down very early next week, as soon as the draft programme passes, which presumably it will. The parties won't. I think it will. I think it'd be a surprise if it didn't. We'll analyse it. We'll then start seeking meetings with parties, with those involved. When we already have them, it's important to say we've been in touch with everyone. We were obviously, between the election campaign and the last few days, we've known who is in negotiations. We were in touch with everybody, all the political parties after the election, but obviously then before Christmas, we knew everybody knew who was going to. So we're in touch with them. So we'll be trying to get more detail, including from the independents. We'll then analyse it and decide what our response is going to be. And then Emily and the colleagues on the media team will have, work to do. We'll be doing public affairs work. We'll be doing stakeholder engagement. We'll be obviously looking for a meeting with the new minister to meet Theresa and potentially others. We usually would do that, meet the new Minister for Children. And we'll be making a decision really based on the content, both what we do, and then a few months from now, obviously, we will be deciding what we look for in Budget 2026. I will say one thing, we will absolutely not be giving up the fight for pay parity. That's not something that we think we can let go of. And if we're not hearing enough about that, if we're not hearing very strong commitments around a journey towards that, around clarity, about what the next 5 years are going to look like in settings and for the system overall, then we will be regrouping and deciding what we do on all fronts. I mean, our work is not just on one front. We do we reach out to all kinds of people, political and other targets. So yeah, there's a bit of a question mark over it now because of the timing until we see what the detail.
Emily, have you anything to add?
No, it does very much so depend on the outcomes of the programme for government, but we will have a media plan in place. So whether that will be some interviews or a press release or an op-ed, we will just make sure we're continuing to advocate and campaign for a high quality early years and school age care system. So yeah, we just want to make sure we use our media tools and our media knowledge to kind of work closely with the public affairs team.
So yeah, that's been really interesting. It's going to be a very interesting year ahead. A lot of work to do, and I suppose watch this space. Keep an eye on the Early Childhood Ireland website, our own social media, and media in general, and we'll keep everybody informed. So that was a really interesting conversation. It's always good to kind of hear the thinking behind the development of the various strategies we use and the outcome of it. And I'd like to thank you both for coming on the podcast today to fill us in on a look back and a look forward, and as I say, watch this space for more. So Frances and Emily, thank you very much.
Thanks, Maura.
Thanks, Maura.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.